Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to go back to some chat history. He just went over 500,000 subscribers, so congratulations, chat history, for that. I will put the link in the description to this video so you can check it out, but also check out all of his other content without my commentary. I'll also post down in the pinned comment a link to my playlist for all the reactions I've done to chat history so far, so you can check all of those out. This one's called Scary Historical Events That Actually Happened. Should be interesting. I don't know what events he covers or how scary or creepy or gory they're gonna get, but you've been warned. Let's dive into this one.
History stories.
Little jump scare there.
If you're well versed in American history, then you know the story of formerly alive President Abraham Lincoln's big night out on the town in 1865. Even if you're familiar with the historical artwork around the matter, you might ask yourself, who the heck are these other people?
Well, that's Clara Harris in the middle. That's Mary Todd Lincoln, and that's Henry Rathbone. There you go. Now you know who they are.
You know Lincoln, sure, and of course the guy using Lincoln's skull as target practice is John Wilkes Booth. But also accompanying the president that night were his wife, Mary, close friend and Union Army Major Henry R. Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Lincoln and the gang were out celebrating the recent Union victory of the American Civil War and were seated in a private viewing box to the right of the stage in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C.
So a couple of things here to point out about all of this.
And
Let's go back here. So you should note that while they have recreated the inside of Ford's Theater to as close to what it would have looked like at the time, it has been completely gutted since then. It was turned into a lot of different things over the years. They had a collapse where like the inside of it basically was destroyed, and it's all been kind of rebuilt to what it looked like at the time, but it has not been restored from 1865 until now. And yeah, it was supposed to be General Grant and his wife that were attending the theater with him that night, but depending on who you listen to about it, it was any combination of the Grants wanting to get to see their kids who were outside of Philadelphia, I think over in New Jersey. And also the fact that General Grant's wife just did not like hanging out with Mrs. Lincoln, which a lot of people didn't like hanging out with Mrs. Lincoln. She had some severe mental health issues. So they ended up with Harris and Rathbone.
In a private viewing box to the right of the stage in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. What do you think of the play, dear? Just then, Confederate sore loser John Wilkes Booth entered the booth and took aim, blasting the president point blank in the head with a .44 caliber lead ball from his single-shot Derringer pistol. At the sound of the gunshot, Rathbone spun around to see Lincoln collapse in his chair with Booth standing in a cloud of smoke. He immediately leapt from his seat and charged the assassin, but Booth came well prepared. In the struggle, Booth was able to equip a dagger and severely slash Rathbone's arm before leaping from the box onto the stage. Right before jumping, Rathbone was able to grab Booth's coat, causing Booth to lose his balance and eat shit, fudging up his...
The typical story that you hear about that is actually that his spur, so Booth had spurs on because he was running to a horse and he was going to get on a horse, caught on the flag because it's not a real far fall. You could make the jump safely if you're balanced and if you're doing it correctly, but if you're kind of caught off balance for whatever reason and you go down, he ends up either cracking or breaking one of his leg bones.
His leg in the process. Despite being in a packed theater of witnesses and bystanders, Booth evaded capture.
Except subscribe us. There's two different, there's actually a number of different eyewitness accounts of what he said, but pretty much everyone agrees he said Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is actually on the Virginia state flag. It's the state motto, thus always to tyrants. But other people also claim to have heard him say the South is avenged.
Days. However, his plan was successful.
Corbett kills Lincoln.
As President Lincoln died from his injuries just 9 hours after the fatal game of tag.
And he actually would have died a lot sooner, but a doctor climbed up into the booth where he was and reached into the bullet hole in the back of his head and pulled out a blood clot, which relieved some of the pressure on his brain and actually allowed him to survive as long as he did. But he was never going to recover.
Rathbone, who passed out due to blood loss but eventually recovered from his injuries, personally placed the weight of the president's death on his shoulders. He believed he should have been able to prevent the assassination, and because of this, he bore immeasurable guilt every day of his life. absolutely destroying his mental well-being to
Yeah.
the point of insanity. After
And he's
resigning
not the
from
only
mil-
one that dealt with insanity. Boston Corbett, the guy who shot Booth, also, well, go read about it yourself and read about how he mutilated himself. That's all I'll say about it.
Military 5 years later, he struggled to find work until eventually given a consul position in Germany by President Arthur. Rathbone's now wife Clara had hoped that the change of scenery would do him some good.
Or murder.
Rathbone's mental health continued to spiral, resulting in him lashing out at his young children and violently threatening Clara. After 13 years of mental deterioration, the breaking point had finally been reached. On December 23, 1883, Rathbone attacked his children in a fit of madness in their home. Clara had rushed to protect her children, but was fatally shot and stabbed by her husband. Instead of continuing his
Of
onslaught,
course, the irony here is that shot and stabbed are exactly what John Wilkes Booth did on April 14th, 1865.
he turned the knife on himself, stabbing himself in the chest
Didn't die, though.
5 times. Despite the failed seppuku attempt, Rathbone survived his wounds, with police finding him covered in blood, claiming that there were people hidden in the walls of his home whispering to him. He was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. During trial, he was officially declared insane by court doctors and committed to an asylum where he died 28 years later.
28 more years. Yeah, it's a really, really sad story, the whole thing from start to finish. Oh, H.H. Holmes.
Henry Howard Holmes was an American con
He
artist.
was not Jack the Ripper, okay? He was not Jack the Ripper. I'm just saying that.
And the U.S.'s first documented serial killer, born the lesser
I will say this about the whole H.H. Holmes thing, and we actually just talked about this. I posted something on Patreon and also in Discord, just asking people what are the historical misconceptions or kind of false stories that drive you nuts. And somebody mentioned H.H. Holmes, and that's accurate. There's actually, while I think people mostly agree on the fact that he was a serial killer, he's not... I mean, in the strictest sense of a definition of a serial killer, he's not. He's only for sure known 100% to have killed one person. He claimed a whole lot more, and he probably killed a lot more with this murder castle and all of that. But he didn't do it because he had a compulsion to kill. He wasn't like a psychopath in that way. He did it for money. He did it for greed.
cool named Herman Mudgett, Holmes attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in 1882, where he allegedly would accompany his professor in various grave robbing activities as a way to supply the school with fresh bodies for examination
And this was a really common thing. You can go to this day. I was just in Ireland at the Glasnevin Cemetery, which is like the national cemetery of Ireland. It's in Dublin, and you can see the towers there. And those towers around the cemetery were there for guards to shoot grave robbers, because this happened a lot. You can see the mort safes in cemeteries like the Church of the Greyfriars Church Cemetery in Edinburgh, Scotland. This was a major problem. Look at the story of Burke and Hare. It's fascinating.
Dissection. It was here that Holmes developed a slight obsession with death, and seldom does such an obsession lead to good things. After graduating medical school in 1884 and being upgraded to Dr. H.H. Holmes, he moved out to Chicago to work in a drugstore, which he eventually bought outright from the owner.
What is drugs?
Proceeds from that store helped to fund his newfound hobby that would soon evolve into something much more sinister. Holmes drew up plans for a hotel, one designed to be a death trap for all who entered. Not the best business model for return customers, but hey. Several contractors and architects were put on the job with a steady rotation of firing and hiring. Now, it's believed that this constant turnover kept everyone from knowing his true design intentions, with no one designer knowing the full scale of the operation at any given time. When it was fully built, the hotel had 3 floors, with the first one being mainly retail and including a new drugstore. Holmes used the hotel to accommodate travelers during the upcoming Chicago World's Fair.
And this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to pinpoint how many people he might have killed, because you had so many people who came in from out of town and who, if they did disappear, they could have disappeared anyway, and it's just the paper trail is really difficult.
1893, which attracted millions of people to the area. Now, according to legend, the hotel contained secret rooms, trick hallways, and trapdoors and torture chambers throughout. It was in this hotel that Holmes would allegedly trap and torture his victims, eventually selling their bodies to the local medical school as a way to satisfy his macabre desires while still making bank. During the World's Fair, Holmes would charisma check dozens of wealthy women to spend the night in the hotel for rest and relaxation, but they would never be seen again. It is believed that as many as 50 women went missing during the World's Fair, all linked to what Holmes would later call his murder castle. In August of the same year, the third floor of the hotel caught fire. While no one was injured, the fire destroyed most of the third floor, but Holmes had an ace up his sleeve: multiple insurance policies. But, like insurance companies do, they refused to pay out and accused Holmes of setting the fire himself and engaging in insurance fraud. Holmes, obviously angered by such accusations, quickly skedaddled out of Chicago. And over the following years, he continued to dabble in insurance fraud with his friend Benjamin Pitezel. For his next trick, Holmes had suffocated Pitezel with chloroform and burned his unconscious body for a life insurance payout. What's even worse is that through extreme coercion and manipulation, Holmes had convinced Pitezel's widowed wife to place 3 of her 5 children into his custody. And over the years, he would murder all 3. Holmes had forced the 2 older children, 13-year-old Alice and 9-year-old Nellie, into a trunk, drilled a hole through it, and plugged it with a gas line, suffocating them. He then buried their bodies in a cellar in his house. As for the third child, 7-year-old Howard, Holmes drugged the boy, dismembered, and burned his body, with only some teeth and bones being the identifying factors. Eventually, the children's remains were discovered, leading to Holmes' arrest and subsequent conviction of the Pitezel murders.
I paused because I had to look it up. I didn't think he was convicted of those 3 Pitezel murders. He wasn't. The only murder he was actually convicted of out of all of this was the father of the Pitezel children. He was presumed to have killed the Pitezel children. He was presumed to have killed a number of other people. He confessed to 27 murders. Some people think it was anywhere from 100 to 200 people that he murdered, but he was only ever convicted of just the one.
Sentenced to death and hanged in 1896, but not before confessing to over 200 murders thanks to his murder castle. But Holmes was...
I don't think he confessed to 200. I think he confessed to 27. I think other people have applied a lot of those to him. And this is also the period of what we call yellow journalism, which is a time when people just pretty much made up anything if it sold papers. That's how you get things like Remember the Maine in 1898, which helps lead the U.S. to war with Spain, even though the Maine was not sunk by the Spanish. Probably exploded from something that happened internally. But they sensationalized this stuff. This is also in the immediate aftermath of the Jack the Ripper murders in the UK, in London, which was not him. And so they saw the opportunity to sensationalize this and really spin it out of control. So really, really unlikely he killed anywhere near that number of people.
Regarded as a habitual liar, and experts believe that there was only enough evidence to link him to 9 murders.
Yeah.
Still a high count, but not nearly the 200 that Holmes had claimed. As for the murder castle, it is confirmed that the stories about the design and the use of the building were widely sensationalized and over-exaggerated by local media. Sucks from a horror standpoint, but still makes a good story nonetheless, right?
Right.
Take a look at this face. Seem familiar at all? If not, then you're useless to me if I start joking. Anyway, this is a death mask, a plaster casting of the face of an unidentified woman who was pulled from the River Seine in Paris in the late 1880s. She became known as L'Inconnue de la Seine, or the unknown woman of the Seine. After being fished out of the French River, her body was placed in the Paris morgue, which, at the time, put nameless corpses on full display for the sake of identification by the general public who happened to be passing by. Oh hey kids, look, it's Grandma! Oh... Because of this strange but effective method, the morgue became a popular tourist and public gathering spot, often referred to as the only free theater in Paris. This particular woman, however, was...
And again, we've talked about this before, but look at what we find interesting today. I can remember when I was a teenager that there was this popular series that people would. This was back when you went and rented videos at the video store. There was this one called Faces of Death, and some of it was real, some of it was completely fake, but it was basically images of people dying or after death, and it was this really macabre stuff, but people are fascinated by that stuff. It goes back to what people loved to watch in the Colosseum or in the Circus Maximus in Rome or in any number of other arenas. It's always been this way in history, that people are fascinated by those kinds of things.
It was a bit of an oddity. Medical examination showed no visible wounds or signs of a struggle, so it was concluded that her death was self-inflicted, with her age being estimated at just 16 years old. But it was her calm, serene expression that caught the attention of a pathologist at the morgue. Since he couldn't take a picture to make it last longer, he decided to instead cast a plaster death mask of her face as a way to immortalize her. Creepily enough, but also to no surprise, many Parisians thought that having a face of a dead woman in their house to be the coolest thing since sliced baguette. Sacre bleu! So countless copies of the death mask were made.
Wow.
From an artistic standpoint, many interpretations claim that the young woman's demeanor expresses a calm control over death, being accepting of its inevitability rather than fear.
It is a really calm and it's really kind of a beautiful face that she has.
A non-artistic viewpoint, you have some dead girl's face hanging on your wall. Over the years, her face had inspired several literary works, pieces of art, and even fashion. But where have you seen her face before? Well, believe it or not, chances are you've actually unknowingly given her mouth to mouth. Because hers is the face of the CPR training doll, which is used in almost all CPR training courses worldwide since 1960. Sure, that might be creepy, but at least it's thematically appropriate.
World War I. Here we go.
World War I was absolutely brutal. It was the forefront of many new innovations in warfare like tanks, heavy machine guns, and manned aircraft. All effective technologies developed for the sake of boosting your own kill count. But another, more sinister tactic was soon deployed onto the battlefield: chemical weapons. Perhaps the most widely used was mustard gas, but others were used too.
So there's a lot of differences between these different kinds of gases. Chlorine gas was readily available for the Germans because it was a byproduct of their industry, so they had it in abundance. Phosgene and chlorine gas were nasty stuff, but they could be countered with a gas mask. Mustard gas couldn't be, because it was not only effective when breathed in, but it could also get on your skin, and it would cause problems to your skin, and it would stick in the clothes, so you couldn't just kind of wait it out by wearing a gas mask, where you could do that with chlorine and phosgene gas.
For instance, chlorine gas, a yellow-green gas which sure enough looks like a stereotypical funny fart cloud.
Right, and that's the gas you typically see, is either that or the mustard gas, because of the very iconic color.
It packs a lethal punch. This story begins in September of 1914, where German soldiers were tasked with taking the Russian-occupied Auschwitz fortress. It was constructed as a Russian Empire border defensive structure against German attack, and boy was it good at its job. German Empire units had repeatedly tried to penetrate the fortress, but were told no through heavy retaliatory gunfire and artillery. Despite facing multiple defeats, stubborn German soldiers refused to give up so easily. 3 assaults were conducted on the fortress over the course of a year. The first saw German infantry losses of about 6,000, while Russian forces only suffered 139. The second assault saw a continued bombardment on the fortress by German artillery, but the Russian soldiers didn't budge.
So these fortresses, a lot of them are built in a time when the biggest artillery pieces that you're dealing with are 12-pounder, 18-pounder, 24-pounder. Even when you start dealing with mortars that can launch like a 100-pound shell, they're really just not going to make a dent in some of these really heavy fortresses. But then eventually you're going to start seeing artillery that is massive in scale, and you've got like these 14, 15, 16-inch guns, but you've also got gas. And gas didn't really kill nearly as many people as people think. We're talking in the tens of thousands throughout the entire war on both sides.
This caused several month-long standoffs, which eventually resulted in German retreat. However, the third assault was to be the one to huff and puff and blow the fortress down. Returning to the fortress in August of 1915, the German forces now had fresh soldiers, even heavier artillery, and multiple canisters of chlorine gas. On the defensive side, the Russian line was only 900 strong, but they still took their chances against the impossible odds. And
if you look at the statistics in terms of the casualties, that makes sense. if you're talking about 150 casualties on the Russian side and 6,000 on the German side in previous attacks, 900 men can probably hold this pretty good.
Waiting several hours for favorable wind conditions, German soldiers bombarded the fortress with the deadly gas to flush out the enemy. The Russian soldiers, unfortunately, had no suitable protection against the gas and had to improvise, covering their faces with the best thing that they could come up with.
Urine.
Rags soaked in piss.
It actually was a very effective chemical way of combating that. And this gas wasn't typically like launched at the enemy, though eventually you get canisters being launched and artillery shells and things like that. Typically they'd wait until the wind was blowing the right way, and then they just open the valves on the gas and just let it creep across. It was heavier than air, so it would kind of stay close to the ground, so you couldn't get underneath it. You just kind of had to take it.
To no surprise, this proved ineffective. The soldiers were severely incapacitated by the gas, and now they smelled like piss.
And this chlorine gas, maybe he's going to talk about it.
As a quick science lesson, when chlorine gas is inhaled, it reacts with the residual moisture in your body, forming hydrochloric acid.
Literally, I was about to say that. It literally, when it reacts with the moisture in your lungs, turns to hydrochloric acid in your lungs. These guys were literally coughing up pieces of their internal organs,
which starts to corrode your internal organs. In short, it causes big ouchies on the inside.
Yeah.
With this mechanism of action being well known, the Germans were certain of their victory and began to infiltrate the fortress, but were met with a horrific sight.
And the attack is something like 12 battalions of German infantry, so you're talking about 7,000 men that are attacking this fortress, and there's maybe 100 Russians that are still alive at this point.
Despite suffering in complete agony, covered in blisters and coughing up lungs and blood, the Russian soldiers still stood their ground and continued fighting. The German troops, of course, scheißed their Hosen at the sight of the
scheißed their Hosen. Crap their pants.
Seemingly undead Russians and fled from the fortress in a complete panic, with some even stumbling into barbed wire in the process. The rest of the German troops immediately hightailed it out of there. Although successful, most of the Russian defense died from the gas.
Right, there's only a couple of people who actually survived this fight on the Russian side, even of the ones who were alive long enough to throw back the Germans. And there's some really good video portrayals of this on YouTube that you can check out. Just look up the Attack of the Dead Men. Obviously, Sabaton has a video about that, and we've done entire videos about Attack of the Dead Men.
Those who did survive barely got by the skin of their whatever they had left. Sadly, Russian troops preemptively demolished most of the fortress as Germans began closing in for a fourth time later that month.
And I do have plans at some point to get to Poland, and the two things at the top of my list that I want to visit when I'm there are the Auschwitz Fortress and Auschwitz.
Just as a quick warning, I'm going to be showing some graphic medical photos
Gross
of real
graphic
syphilis
content
patients.
warning.
So if you don't want to see that, click away now.
You've been warned.
There you go. Usually when you hear the phrase Italian Renaissance, you think of high-class society, revolutionary innovation, and lots of statues of dudes with their dicks out. Well, allow me to throw a wrench in that perception.
That's true. If you go, like I'm going back to Florence and Rome in a little less than a month with my sister, and I was there this past spring. Definitely true.
Introducing you to the concept of syphilis zombies. Syphilis, like the guy with the boulder? No, silly. Syphilis, like the STD. Quick backstory. In 1494, the King of Naples, Ferdinand I, died of butthole cancer. If his name sounds familiar, it's because he's one of those evil kings that I covered in a previous video, so you can check that out if you haven't. Wink. Anyway, Ferdy's son Alfonso II took his daddy's throne but was quickly put in a state of check by French King Guy Charles VIII, who claimed that he had claim to the throne because of his noble Angevin bloodline. Or so he claimed. Little Alfonso was like, well, how about you just take Milan instead? Your lawn? No, Milan. Well, why would I want your lawn? I hate mowing. Are you serious right now? After some clarification, King Charles agreed, and with 30-some thousand soldiers, invaded Italy, took over Milan, but felt unsatisfied. Oh sweet, Charles took Milan. Oh, he's heading this way too. Why is he heading this way? Naples was also taken. With such a successful campaign through the peninsula, the French army, which consisted of Spanish, Swiss, Flemish, and even Italian soldiers, decided to celebrate. And you bet your sweet balls that meant women and alcohol were involved in medically inadvisable quantities. When you have a bunch of people from all over Europe quite literally come together in one city, there's gonna be some interesting results. This one was syphilis. Actually, it was kind of like a super syphilis, as historians generally agree that the strain that went around was much more severe than its modern cousin that we are more familiar with.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I talk a lot about with people when we debate this idea, because people talk about, remember this time period, this is the 1490s, you've had the New World explored for the first time, and of course things like smallpox get taken over and diseases like that wipe out just with impunity thousands and thousands of the indigenous population there because they have no built-up tolerance to it. And when I've shared in the past about how syphilis was brought back, people say, well, hey, we've got proof that syphilis existed in Europe long before that, and that's absolutely true. But this particular super strain that appears, they believe was brought back from the New World because it was something that the Europeans didn't have any kind of a tolerance to, just like the indigenous people didn't have a tolerance to things like smallpox. So it kind of got shared both ways, and they believe that this particular strain did get brought over.
That is the rhetorical we, of course. This meant that the disease was much more contagious with symptoms that were much more severe. Since it was the Renaissance, let me paint you a picture of how it all went down. Your first step is finishing up your very consensual physical time slot with a local woman of the night. During your bi-weekly wash, you notice something around your own peninsula. You have genital ulcers, small open wounds forming around your tender meat log. But that worry is quickly put to rest as you develop a bad fever, multiple rashes, and muscle pain. Get used to that because you're going to be like that for a few months. As you continue to live your now much more miserable life, you discover the formation of big, stinky, painful sores and abscesses across your body.
Brutal.
These sores start to penetrate deeper and deeper into your tissue until your flesh quite literally rots to the bone.
This is a time when you don't have things like antibiotics, so there's really very little you can do about it.
The bacteria eats away at your skin, your eyes, your nose, and your lips. You don't die just yet, but you wish you would. For months or even years, piece by piece, you fall apart, with chunks of your body just sliding right off. Got your nose. Thousands of people were walking around like this
Oh my gosh.
day in and day out. Eventually, the soldiers were expelled from Italy and returned to their respective homes. Within a few years, syphilis ran rampant through most of Europe, and by
Yeah, and you have situations with all of this where, and I've seen this even in the 19th century. I was doing some research on my third great-grandfather who came home from the Civil War with syphilis and continued to have relations with his wife. And then their children that were born after he came back were also born with syphilitic sores all over their body. I read medical accounts in his pension file of this. It's brutal stuff. So it's not just the person who has the disease initially that pays for it. Often their families pay for it too.
By 1520, the so-called French disease infected Africa and Asia as well. So remember, fellas and fellettes, never engage in sexual relations with a 15th century French soldier in Naples. But you can still finger that subscribe button, and you can also watch more videos. I'll see you.
I got to give him a lot of credit, especially in that last one. The way he used the words in describing that was pretty witty, I have to say. So that was interesting. All right, so there you go. We learned some things I didn't know, that's for sure. And I hope you enjoyed, if that's the right word, this conversation that we've had about some of the less glorious parts of history. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Check out the link to the original content, or if you are already familiar with the channel, check out my link to all of my other reactions I've done to that channel at other times in the past. Thanks for watching.